The land west of the Pecos River did not suffer fools, nor did it offer comfort. It was a place of raw truths, etched in cracked earth and bleached bone. Summer was a hammer, beating the plains into a shimmering anvil of heat that could kill a man as quick as a bullet. Winter was a razor, its winds scraping the world down to its skeletal core, and between them was the dust. It was the taste of every meal, the grit in every breath, a constant, swirling reminder that the land itself was trying to bury you. Towns like Redemption Creek were not so much built as they were surrendered to the emptiness. A few dozen wooden buildings clinging together for warmth against an indifferent sky, miles from the nearest rail line, connected to the rest of the world by little more than a rumor and a rutted stagecoach trail. It was in this world that Eli Shepherd moved, a man who seemed carved from the same unforgiving landscape he worked. At 35, his face was a map of sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that weren't from smiling. He was digging now, in the teeth of a sandstorm that had turned the afternoon sky to a bruised, ochre twilight. The wind howled like a mourner, tearing at his worn shirt and flinging sand that stung his skin like hornets. He didn't flinch. His movements were spare and rhythmic, the plunge and lift of the shovel a grim testament to practice. In the hole at his feet lay Jupiter, a big roan gelding with a coat the color of a stormy dawn. A snakebite to the leg, swift and merciless, had brought the powerful animal down. Eli had sat with him through the night, a hand on the horse's shuddering neck, until the last tremor of life had gone. Now, he was giving him a proper burial. It was a fool's errand in a sandstorm, the grave filling almost as fast as he could dig it. But it was a matter of respect. A man paid his debts, especially to a creature who had served him faithfully. Loss was a constant companion out here. You didn't weep over it. You dug a hole, said your piece to the wind, and filled it back in. The grating scrape of his shovel against a stone sent a phantom echo through his memory. It sounded for a moment like the cocking of a rifle hammer in the dead of a Missouri night. He paused, his knuckles white on the wooden handle. The wind was a chorus of screams, and for a heartbeat, he was no longer a rancher burying a horse. He was 20 years old again, a Union scout with a face still soft from boyhood, lying in the mud with the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. He could feel the familiar weight of the Sharps rifle in his hands, see the flicker of a Confederate campfire through the trees. He remembered the cold calculus of survival, the faces of men he had watched fall, the ones he had sent into the dark himself. The war had ended, but the violence had followed him west, clinging to him like a shadow. He had tried to outrun it, buying this isolated patch of land, hoping the silence would deafen the ghosts. But trouble had a way of finding him. Sometimes it came looking for the man he used to be, the vigilante who had cleaned out a nest of rustlers with a cold fury that had become the stuff of local legend. It was why men in Redemption Creek gave him a wide berth, their respect curdled with a healthy dose of fear. They knew Eli Shepherd was a man best left alone. He shook the memory away like a persistent fly and returned to his work. The hole was deep enough. With a grunt, he rolled the heavy canvas-wrapped body of the horse into the earth. He stood for a moment, head bowed against the wind, his silent farewell lost in the storm's roar. Then he began to fill the grave, the hard-won space disappearing back into the land, leaving only a slight mound that the wind would level by morning. By the time he was done, the storm was beginning to tire, the sky lightening to a sickly yellow. He leaned on his shovel, his breathing heavy, a solitary figure against the vast, desolate expanse. The mail rider, a wiry young man named Billy, had braved the end of the storm to make his rounds. He found Eli washing the grit from his face and hands at the water pump near the barn. "Afternoon, Mr. Shepherd," Billy said, reining in his weary-looking pony. "Got a letter for you." Eli dried his hands on his trousers, his expression unreadable. He rarely received mail. "From back east, looks like," Billy offered, holding out a crisp, cream-colored envelope. The penmanship was elegant, unfamiliar. Eli took it without a word. He didn't recognize the name on the return address. He slid his thumb under the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was from a man named Silas Croft, a land speculator from St. Louis. The letter was polite, filled with florid language, but its meaning was plain. Mr. Croft had heard of Eli's considerable acreage and the quality of his well water, a rare commodity in these parts. He was prepared to make a generous offer for a southern parcel of his land, a section that bordered the creek. The price he named was indeed generous, too generous. A cold knot tightened in Eli's gut. He had heard whispers of men like Croft, vultures in fine suits who came ahead of the railroad, buying up land and water rights for pennies on the dollar from unsuspecting ranchers, then selling them for a fortune. They were a different kind of predator than the ones he was used to, but predators all the same. He folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Any reply?" Billy asked. Hopeful. A reply meant a coin for a drink at the saloon. "No reply," Eli said, his voice flat. He turned and walked back toward his small, sturdy house, leaving the mail rider to ride on. The unease from the letter lingered, a low thrum beneath the surface. It was a disturbance in the quiet life he had fought so hard to build, a sign that the outside world, with all its greed and complications, was pressing in. That same afternoon, the overland stagecoach, 6 days out of Santa Fe, rattled into Redemption Creek. It was an event that drew the town's inhabitants from their routines. The merchant, Mr. Abernathy, came to the door of his general store, wiping his hands on his apron. A few dusty cowboys paused on the saloon porch, squinting at the commotion. Women peered from behind curtains. A stagecoach arrival meant news, fresh supplies, and sometimes new faces. The face that emerged this time was hidden behind a delicate white veil. A woman, dressed in a simple but elegant traveling dress the color of fresh cream, stepped down onto the dusty street. She moved with a grace that seemed out of place among the rough-hewn buildings, her gloved hands clutching a small reticule. She was slender and tall, her posture straight, but there was a tremor in her hands that betrayed a deep-seated nervousness. She was, unmistakably, a bride. She stood for a moment, a pale flower in a desert of brown. As the driver unloaded a single, large trunk, the whispers started immediately, a rustle of speculation that passed through the small crowd. They had heard the rumors. Graham Tooley, the town's most prosperous merchant, a man who owned the hotel and had a stake in the silver mine up in the hills, had been boasting for weeks about the mail-order bride he had arranged for. He had sent for a woman from a respectable family back east. He'd claimed someone with refinement. The veiled woman scanned the faces watching her, her head held high, though Eli, had he been there, would have recognized the look of a cornered animal. She approached Mr. Abernathy, her voice soft but clear. "Excuse me, sir, I am looking for Mr. Graham Tooley. I was told he would be expecting me." Abernathy, a portly man with a kind face, gestured toward the swinging doors of the saloon. "He's likely over at the Gilded Cage, ma'am. Spends most afternoons there." Her hesitation was almost imperceptible. A saloon was no place for a lady, especially one arriving under such circumstances. But she had little choice. With a nod of thanks, she gathered her courage and walked across the street, the fine fabric of her dress gathering the red dust of Redemption Creek. The eyes of the entire town followed her. The Gilded Cage saloon was a den of noise, smoke, and the sour smell of stale beer. The moment Catherine Hale pushed through the doors, a sudden silence fell. The tinkling of the piano faltered. Men at the bar turned to stare. In the center of the room, holding court at a poker table, was Graham Tooley. He was a large man in his late 40s, his waistcoat straining at the buttons, his face flushed with whiskey and self-importance. He looked up, a smirk playing on his thick lips as he saw her. Well, he boomed, his voice filling the room. "Look what the stage dragged in. The blushing bride arrives." He made no move to stand, instead gesturing for her to approach with a flick of his fingers, as one might summon a dog. Catherine walked toward him, her steps measured, the veil hiding the flush of humiliation she could feel creeping up her neck. She stopped before his table. "Mr. Tooley," she said, her voice a fragile thread in the coarse atmosphere. "I am Catherine Hale." He leaned back in his chair, scrutinizing her from head to toe, his eyes lingering in a way that made her feel undressed. He chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Take off the veil, girl," he commanded. "Let's have a look at the goods." Her hands trembled as she lifted the fine netting from her face. The saloon was dim, but the light from the door illuminated her features. She had a strong, fine-boned face, with wide, intelligent gray eyes and a mouth that was set in a firm, proud line. At 28, she was no longer a girl, and the anxieties of her journey and her uncertain future had etched faint lines of weariness around her eyes. She was elegant, handsome even, but she was not the dewy, pliable young thing Tooley had clearly been expecting. His smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer of open disappointment. He looked her over again, this time with the critical eye of a livestock buyer inspecting a mare. 28. The letter said, he scoffed, loud enough for the entire saloon to hear. "Looks more like 38 to me. A bit shop-worn. Wouldn't you say, boys?" A few of his cronies at the table snickered. Catherine stood frozen, her face burning. "I am precisely the age I stated in my letters. Mr. Tooley," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "And I suppose you're a virtuous daughter of a fine family, too," he shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's be plain. Miss Hale, I sent for a wife, a young, pretty thing to warm my bed and give me sons. I paid your passage. I expected fresh goods, not something that's been sitting on the shelf too long." He tossed a few coins onto the table. "You look like a grifter in a bride's dress, and I'll not be made a fool of. The deal is off." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. The silence in the saloon was absolute. Every man present a witness to her utter degradation. Her pride, the only thing she had left, was being systematically dismantled in front of a room full of strangers. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and sharp, but she refused to let them fall. "You are mistaken, sir," she whispered, her throat tight. "I am not a—" "I don't care what you are." He cut her off, waving a dismissive hand. "But you are not my bride. Now get out of my sight. Your presence is spoiling my drink." He turned back to his card game as if she no longer existed. The spell was broken. The piano player tentatively began a new tune. Men turned back to their drinks, whispering and smirking. She was dismissed, discarded, shamed, and utterly alone. Catherine turned and fled. She pushed through the swinging doors and out into the harsh sunlight, her breath coming in ragged sobs she could no longer contain. She did not look back. She could feel the stares of the townsfolk on her back, their curiosity now replaced with pity and contempt. She had been publicly branded as worthless. She did not know where she was going. She just ran, away from the town, away from the mocking faces and the cruel laughter that echoed in her ears. She stumbled past the last buildings, her elegant dress a mockery, and out into the vast, open desert. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red. She ran until her lungs burned and her side ached, her only instinct to put as much distance as possible between herself and her humiliation. The desert offered no comfort. The scrub and rock tore at the hem of her dress. The silence was as vast and unforgiving as the saloon had been loud and cruel. Night fell quickly, the last light swallowed by a profound and starless dark. The temperature dropped. She was lost, exhausted, and dehydrated. Her sobs gave way to a weary, shuddering despair. She stumbled on, driven by a fear of the darkness and the things that might live in it, until her legs could carry her no more. She saw the faint, dark shape of a building ahead, a barn, looming against the horizon. It was a shelter, a hope. She staggered toward it, her vision blurring at the edges. She reached the rough wooden wall of the structure and slid down to the ground, the last of her strength gone. The world dissolved into a black, silent wave, and she knew no more. Eli found her the next morning. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. He was heading to the barn to check on his remaining livestock when he saw the crumpled heap of white fabric by the wall. His first thought was that it was a deer, brought down by a coyote. He approached cautiously, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. Then he saw the shape of a woman, her face pale as wax, her dark hair splayed in the dust. Her fine dress was torn and stained. He knelt beside her, his movements economical. He felt for a pulse at her neck. It was faint, but steady. Her skin was cool and dry. Dehydration, exhaustion. He recognized the bride from town, even in this remote place. News traveled. He had heard Billy the mail rider telling the story to the blacksmith just yesterday. He considered his options. He could lift her onto his wagon and take her back to town, leave her with the doctor or the preacher's wife. But that would mean facing the very people she had clearly run from. He looked at her face, still and vulnerable in sleep, and saw not the grifter Graham Tooley had described, but simply a woman at the end of her rope. Something in her desperation resonated with the part of him that had also sought refuge in this empty land. With a sigh that was almost a groan, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. He carried her into the barn and laid her gently on a clean pile of hay in an empty stall. He fetched a dipper of water from the pump and a clean rag. He knelt and gently wiped the dust from her face, then moistened her lips with water. Her eyelids fluttered open. Her gray eyes, wide and unfocused at first, slowly sharpened on his face. Fear flashed in them. Stark and immediate. She tried to scramble backward, a small, panicked sound escaping her throat. "Easy now," Eli said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "You're safe." "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice raspy. "Where am I?" "You're on my land. You collapsed by the barn." Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of pure terror. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please, do not take me back to town. I cannot go back there. Please." The raw desperation in her voice was something he understood all too well. It was the plea of a hunted thing. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his face impassive. He was a man who had built his life on solitude, on keeping the world at arm's length. This woman was a complication he did not need. She was trouble, tied to a man he despised, but he could not bring himself to drag her back to her tormentors. It went against a code buried deep within him, a remnant of a man he once was. He stood up, his tall frame blocking the light from the barn door. "I won't take you back," he said finally. He gestured to the dipper of water and a piece of jerky he had pulled from his pocket and set beside her. "Eat, rest, but once you've recovered your strength, you have to leave." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her alone in the quiet shadows of the barn. He had offered a moment of mercy, a brief sanctuary. It was more than he had offered anyone in a long time. It was all he was willing to give. For 3 days, the barn was Catherine's world. The sweet, dusty smell of hay filled her lungs, a scent of honest labor that was a world away from the cloying perfumes and city smoke she had known. Through the wide, open doors, she had a framed view of Eli Shepherd's life, and she became a student of its quiet rhythms. She watched him rise before the sun, his movements economical and sure as he fed the chickens and milked his lone cow. She watched him mend a broken fence line, his back a solid, unyielding line against the vast horizon. He moved with a purpose that seemed to come from deep within, a man rooted to his land in a way she had never seen before. He was not a handsome man in the way of city gentlemen. His face was too hard, his features too stark, his hands calloused and scarred. But there was a strength in him that she found herself drawn to, a silent competence that was more compelling than any practiced charm. He was a man who seemed to have no need for the world's approval. He spoke little, and only when necessary. To his animals, he murmured in a low, gentle voice. To himself, not at all. He ate his meals on the porch of his small house, simple affairs of bread, beans, and jerky, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. He was a fortress of a man, and she found herself wondering what wars he had fought to build such formidable walls. Eli was aware of her presence in a way that was a constant, low-grade irritant. He had learned long ago that caring was a vulnerability, an open wound that always invited infection. He had buried his younger brother, his parents, and more comrades than he could count. He had learned to cauterize his heart, to pack the void with work and silence. This woman, with her refined manners and her haunted, intelligent eyes, was a threat to that hard-won peace. He noticed the way she ate the food he left for her, with a delicacy that seemed absurd in the rustic setting of a barn stall. He saw how she neatly folded the rough woolen blanket he had given her each morning, placing it at the edge of the hay. He heard her humming once, a soft, melancholic tune that snagged in his memory and refused to let go. She was a piece of a different world, a world of parlors and books and soft hands. And she had no place here. He told himself her presence was temporary. He was just a stopping point, a brief shelter from the storm. As soon as she was strong enough, she would be gone, and his life would return to its solitary, predictable shape. He was a man who knew how to wait things out. On the fourth day, Catherine felt her strength return. The shame of her ordeal in town had not lessened, but the immediate terror had subsided, replaced by a quiet, gnawing uncertainty. She could not stay in this man's barn forever. She had no money, no prospects, and nowhere to go. The only thing she owned was the tattered dress on her back and the contents of her trunk, which still sat on the porch of the Redemption Creek Hotel. She had to earn her keep. She emerged from the barn, blinking in the bright morning sun. Eli was at the chopping block, splitting firewood with a powerful, efficient swing of his axe. The rhythmic thud echoed in the clear air. She approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Shepherd," she began, her voice still a little weak. He finished his swing, sinking the axe deep into the block, but did not turn to look at her. "You should be resting." "I am rested enough," she said, clasping her hands to keep them from trembling. "I cannot continue to accept your charity. I wish to work, to repay your kindness." He finally turned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. His gaze was unnervingly direct. "I don't need any help. Nevertheless, I must insist." She pressed on, a flicker of her old resolve returning. "There must be something I can do. Mending, cooking, I am a decent seamstress." He looked at her hands, soft and uncalloused. He thought of the endless, brutal chores the ranch demanded. "This is no place for a lady's work." "I am no longer a lady," she said, a bitter edge to her voice. "A lady would not have been run out of town like a stray dog. A lady would not be sleeping in your barn. Please, allow me to make myself useful." He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. He saw not a grifter, but a woman drowning, her pride the last piece of driftwood she clung to. He gave a short, sharp nod, his expression grim. "The chickens need feeding. There's a vegetable patch behind the house that's choked with weeds." He turned back to his woodpile without another word. The conversation over. It was not kindness. He told himself it was a practical matter. If she was working, she was not simply waiting. Her departure would be a transaction settled, not a mercy he had to carry. Catherine took to the work with a quiet determination that surprised him. She was clumsy at first. The chickens scattered from her in a flurry of feathers, and she struggled with the weight of the water bucket. But she did not complain. She weeded the small garden on her hands and knees, her fine dress bundled up, her face smudged with dirt. In the evenings, using a needle and thread she found in a tin in his house, she sat in the barn doorway, meticulously mending the tears in his work shirts. He watched her from a distance, this strange, graceful creature who was methodically inserting herself into the barren landscape of his life. He remained closed, his words sparse, his demeanor unchanged. But a silent routine began to form between them. He would leave her a plate of food on a crate by the barn door. She would leave his mended shirt, neatly folded, in the same spot. They were two planets in a solitary orbit, held together by an unspoken gravity, never touching. The sky began to curdle a week after she arrived. The air grew thick and heavy, and a bruised purple stain spread across the western horizon. By evening, the storm broke with a theatrical fury. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets, and thunder cracked the sky open like a whip, the sound so close it shook the very foundations of the barn. Catherine huddled in the hay, her arms wrapped around her knees. She had always been frightened of storms, but this was different. It felt biblical, a force of nature bent on tearing the world apart. Through the sheets of rain, she saw a light flicker in the house. A few moments later, the door opened and Eli emerged, a lantern in his hand, his head bare to the downpour. He was heading for the barn. He had one other horse, a young, high-strung bay mare named Daisy. The thunder was likely terrifying her. He slid the heavy barn door open and stepped inside, rain streaming from his hair and shoulders. In the flickering lantern light, she saw that he had stripped off his shirt, his chest and back bare. The horse was in a frenzy, her eyes wide with terror, kicking at the walls of her stall. "Easy now, girl," Eli murmured, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's roar. "Easy." He didn't seem to notice Catherine in the shadows. All his focus was on the terrified animal. He slipped into the stall, moving with a calm, deliberate grace. He ran a soothing hand along the mare's trembling neck, speaking to her in that same quiet, steady tone. The muscles in his back and shoulders coiled and relaxed as he moved, a landscape of lean, hard strength. A bolt of lightning lit the sky, and for a split second, the interior of the barn was illuminated in a brilliant, blue-white flash. In that instant, Eli turned his head. His eyes, dark and intense, met Catherine's across the stall. The world froze. The roar of the thunder, the drumming of the rain, the panicked breaths of the horse, it all faded into a deafening silence. There was only the look that passed between them, a raw, unguarded connection that stripped away the pretense of their careful distance. It was a look of shared solitude, of a deep, unspoken understanding of the storms that raged both outside and within. Then the darkness crashed back in, thicker than before, and the moment was gone. But the air remained, heavy and charged with something new, something dangerous. He stayed with the horse until she quieted, his presence a calming anchor in the chaos. Catherine did not move. She watched the play of lantern light on his skin, the patient strength in his hands. When the mare was finally calm, her breathing even, he gave her a final pat and stepped out of the stall. He walked toward the main doors, his bare feet silent on the straw-strewn floor. He passed the stall where she was hidden, and she thought he would leave without a word, that the moment in the lightning flash would remain unspoken, a ghost between them. But then he stopped. He did not turn around. "You should not be afraid of a little thunder," he said, his back to her. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She found her voice, a whisper in the echoing dark. "It is not the thunder I am afraid of." He stood motionless for a long time. Then he slowly turned to face her. The lantern on the ground cast long, dancing shadows, making a hollow of his cheek, a darkness of his eyes. The tension that had been a low simmer for days now crackled in the air. She rose from the hay and walked toward him, her bare feet making no sound. She stopped just before him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the rain on his hair. She lifted a hand, her fingers hesitating for a moment before she touched his chest. His skin was warm, slick with rain. A shudder went through him at her touch. She raised herself on her toes and kissed him. It was a soft, tentative kiss, a question asked in the dark. For a moment, he was utterly still, his body rigid. Then, his hand came up and his fingers closed around her arm, not cruelly, but with an undeniable strength. He pulled away, breaking the kiss. His eyes searched her face in the dim light, his expression a mixture of anger and something else she could not name. "Do not do that," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I don't want something I can't keep." The words were a wall, slammed down between them. He saw her as a fleeting thing, a bird with a broken wing that would one day fly away. He was a man who owned nothing he could not hold in his hands or fence in with wire. A woman like her, a ghost from another world, was not something he could ever hope to keep. The rejection stung, but she understood it. He was pushing her away to protect himself. "You think I am running from that man in town?" she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "From Mr. Tooley." "It does not matter who you are running from." "But it does," she insisted, her gaze unwavering. "I was not running from a man. I was running from a truth that says a woman is worth only what a man is willing to pay for her. A truth that has followed me my entire life." The raw honesty in her words seemed to breach his defenses. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the ruined bride to the woman beneath, a woman who had been fighting a war of her own. His grip on her arm loosened. He let out a long, slow breath. The storm outside was beginning to pass, the thunder retreating into a distant rumble. "You can stay," he said, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. "For a while, as a hired hand, I will pay you a small wage. You can earn your passage to wherever it is you need to go." He paused, his eyes hard. "But there are lines you will not cross. I am not in the market for a fairy tale bride, or anything else." It was an offer and a warning, a chance to stay, but within the safety of his walls. She nodded, accepting his terms. It was more than anyone else had offered her. Rumors, in a town like Redemption Creek, were a crop that grew in any soil. The story of Graham Tooley's public dismissal of his mail-order bride was a prize harvest. But the bride's subsequent disappearance was an even juicier fruit. Some said she had thrown herself in the creek. Others whispered that she had been taken by coyotes, or worse, by Apaches. The most scandalous rumor, and therefore the most popular, was that she had simply hitched up her skirts and taken the next stage out of town with some traveling salesman's wallet in her reticule. Graham Tooley encouraged this last version. It painted him as the savvy judge of character, the man who had seen through the wiles of a conniving woman. But his private fury festered. He had been made to look like a fool, and his pride was a tender, easily bruised thing. The whispers took a new direction when Eli Shepherd, a man who came to town only when absolutely necessary, began making weekly trips to Abernathy's general store. He bought his usual supplies, flour, coffee, beans, ammunition. But then he started buying other things: a bar of scented soap, a length of plain calico cloth, more food than one man could possibly eat. People started to notice. Abernathy, a gossip at heart, mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it to the preacher's wife. And soon the whole town was buzzing. The reclusive rancher had a guest, and there was only one woman who had recently gone missing. Graham Tooley heard the talk, and his face purpled with rage. The thought of that woman, his discarded property. Finding shelter with a man like Shepherd was an intolerable insult. He cornered Deputy Miller, a thin, rat-faced man whose loyalty was easily purchased, outside the saloon. "I want you to ride out to Shepherd's place," Tooley said, pressing a few silver dollars into the deputy's palm. "Do some looking around. I have a suspicion he is harboring a fugitive. That woman is a swindler. I want to know what he is up to." Catherine knew nothing of the rumors. Her world had shrunk to the boundaries of Eli's ranch. A fragile truce existed between them now. They worked side by side in a silence that was no longer entirely uncomfortable. She learned to milk the cow, to collect eggs without being pecked, to recognize the tracks of deer and coyote. He, in turn, began to rely on her quiet presence. He found his mended clothes laid out for him, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove in the morning, the cabin swept clean. She never entered his space when he was there, and he never entered the barn at night. They respected the lines he had drawn. One afternoon, she saw him from the house, kneeling in the pasture. A coyote had gotten into the herd during the night, and a newborn calf had been badly wounded, its leg mangled. Eli had his rifle with him, but he was just kneeling there, a hand on the small creature's back. She watched as he ended its suffering with a quick, merciful shot from his pistol. Then, just as he had with his horse. He fetched a shovel and began to dig a hole. She walked out to him, carrying a dipper of water. He was covered in sweat and dirt, his face a grim mask. He took the dipper and drank deeply. She looked down at the small, canvas-wrapped body in the grave. She spoke softly, her voice carrying on the dry breeze. "You hide your heart in graves." The words hit him like a stone. He stiffened, and his head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a sudden, raw anger. "What do you know about my heart?" he snarled, his voice dangerously low. "You know nothing about me." "I know what I see," she replied, unafraid. "I see a man who feels lost so deeply he has to bury it in the ground and pretend it is not there." "You will be silent," he bit out, taking a step toward her. "You are a hired hand. You will remember your place." The unfairness of the attack, the cruelty of it, brought tears to her eyes, but she did not back down. My place is wherever I can find solid ground to stand on. You gave me that. Do not try to take it away now." He stopped, the fury in his face warring with something else, shame. He looked at her standing there, defiant and wounded, and the anger drained out of him, leaving him weary and exposed. He turned away, running a hand over his face. "I apologize," he said, the words sounding foreign and rusty on his tongue. That was uncalled for. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. That night, after a silent supper eaten on opposite ends of the porch, she was gathering her plate when her fingers brushed against his hand. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, his calloused palm facing hers. She gently laid her hand in his. They sat like that for a long time as dusk settled around them. The silence no longer a barrier, but a shared space. They were two separate souls, but for the first time, in the deepening shadows, they were not entirely alone. The tension between them had changed. It was no longer just a current of unspoken attraction, but the low, simmering heat of two people beginning to recognize the shape of their own broken pieces in the other. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of quiet, one that was not empty but shared. The hard lines of Eli's solitude began to soften, blurred by the constant, steady presence of Catherine. They moved around the ranch in a rhythm that was at first dissonant, then slowly, miraculously, found its harmony. The sharp ring of his hammer on the anvil was answered by the soft scrape of her hoe in the garden. The low creak of his saddle leather was a prelude to the scent of baking bread that now sometimes drifted from the house. A mutual respect, born from the shared language of hard work, grew between them. Eli saw that beneath her refined exterior was a core of resilient steel. She never shirked a task, no matter how menial or difficult. He once found her struggling to reset a fallen stone in the creek bed, her face grim with determination, her clothes soaked. He had taken the stone from her without a word and settled it into place, and the look of gratitude she gave him was more eloquent than any thank you. He began to see her not as a problem to be solved or a guest to be endured, but as a partner. In turn, Catherine's skills began to transform the rough edges of his existence. He lived a life of pure function, and she brought to it a subtle order, a touch of grace he did not know he was missing. She organized the chaotic mess of receipts and ledgers in his desk, creating a system that made sense of his earnings and expenses. She showed him which wild herbs to gather on the hillside, yarrow to pack a wound, willow bark for a fever. He came in from the fields one day with a deep gash on his arm from a barbed wire fence. He was preparing to splash it with whiskey and tie a dirty rag around it, as he always did. But she stopped him, her touch gentle on his wrist. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and applied a poultice of crushed leaves that soothed the fire in his skin. As she wrapped his arm in a strip of clean linen, her focused frown and the careful movements of her hands stirred something in him, a feeling of being tended to that was so ancient and foreign he could not put a name to it. But while their private world became a sanctuary, the outside world remained hostile. The whispers in Redemption Creek had grown from a rustle to a roar. Eli, on his infrequent trips for supplies, ignored them. He was a man who had faced down gunfire. The sideways glances and hushed comments of small-minded people were less than gnats to him. He would walk into Abernathy's store, his face a mask of indifference, state his needs, pay his due, and leave. He offered no explanations and asked for no acceptance. For Catherine, it was a torment. She felt the weight of the town's judgment like a physical shroud. She was the runaway bride, the woman of questionable morals who had taken up with the reclusive, dangerous rancher. She was a story they told themselves, a cautionary tale, and it erased the woman she actually was. She began to dread Eli's trips to town, waiting with a knot of anxiety in her stomach for his return, searching his face for any sign that the town's poison had seeped in. The day came when they were running low on flour and salt, and Eli had to mend a broken axle on the wagon. A full day's work. There was no choice but for her to go. She put on her one good dress, the cream-colored traveling suit, now mended and cleaned as best she could. She tied her hair back severely and held her head high as she drove the small buckboard into Redemption Creek. The silence that fell as she hitched the horse outside the general store was a living thing. It was heavy and suffocating. Inside, two women she recognized as the banker's wife and the blacksmith's sister were talking to Mr. Abernathy. They stopped mid-sentence as she entered, their eyes sweeping over her with cold appraisal before they turned their backs pointedly, resuming their conversation in exaggeratedly low tones. Catherine's face burned. She walked to the counter, her hands clenched at her sides. "Good morning, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I need 20 pounds of flour and 5 of salt, please." Abernathy, a man who usually had a kind word for everyone, avoided her eyes. He grunted and began to scoop the flour into a sack, his movements brusque. From behind her, Catherine heard a stage whisper, perfectly calculated to be overheard. "To think of it, living out there with him, it is a disgrace." "She has no shame," the other woman replied. "A harlot in a bride's dress, that is what she is." The words struck Catherine with a physical force, stealing the air from her lungs. A harlot in a bride's dress. The phrase was so cruel, so perfectly designed to wound, that she felt a wave of dizziness. She stood frozen, the blood roaring in her ears. "Mr." Abernathy slammed the sacks of flour and salt onto the counter. "That will be $1.20, he said, still not looking at her. She fumbled in her reticule for the coins Eli had given her, her fingers numb and clumsy. She placed them on the counter and fled, leaving the supplies behind. She did not stop until she was back in the barn, the familiar scent of hay and animals a small comfort. There, in the shadows, she finally allowed the tears to come. Great, wrenching sobs of shame and despair that shook her entire body. Eli found her there an hour later, curled in the hay, weeping as if her heart had been shattered. The sight of her profound distress sent a jolt of cold fury through him. He knelt beside her, his large frame suddenly seeming awkward and inadequate. He did not know the words of comfort. They were a language he had long forgotten. "Catherine," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes raw with pain. "They called me a harlot," she choked out. "A harlot in a bride's dress." He saw in that moment the full weight of the humiliation she had been carrying, the burden of a world that had judged and condemned her without a trial. He saw the proud, resilient woman he had come to know reduced to this, and an unfamiliar, fiercely protective instinct rose in him. He reached out and touched her chin, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He lifted her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark and serious, and for the first time, she saw the walls around his own heart crack, allowing her a glimpse of the man within. "They do not know what you have been through," he said, his voice low and intense. "But I do." He did not mean the specifics of her past, of which he knew nothing. He meant the deeper truth of it. He recognized the brand of shame, the pain of being an outcast, the lonely struggle for survival. In his own way, He was telling her she was not alone. The storm that had been gathering between them for weeks finally broke. The air in the barn was thick with unspoken things, with the scent of hay and rain and the raw, undeniable pull of two solitary souls who had found a mirror in each other. That night, she sought him out. He was standing in the loft, looking out the high window at the moon, a silver sliver in a sea of stars. She climbed the ladder, her heart pounding a heavy, deliberate rhythm against her ribs. He heard her and turned, his face half in shadow, half in moonlight. She walked to him and, without a word, reached up and kissed him again. This time, he did not pull away. This time, he met her kiss with a hunger that startled them both. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks as if she were something precious, something he had been afraid to touch. The kiss was not soft or tentative like the first one had been. It was deep and desperate, a release of all the tension, all the loneliness, all the carefully guarded longing that had simmered between them. His arms went around her, pulling her tight against his hard body, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, surrendering to the overwhelming feeling of rightness, of coming home to a place she had never been before. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the softest, deepest pile of hay. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers, asking a question she had already answered with her kiss. In the quiet, moonlit sanctuary of the loft, they made love. It was a slow, silent discovery, a conversation conducted in touch and breath. For Eli, it was the breaking of a long and bitter fast, a reawakening of a part of himself he had thought long dead and buried. For Catherine, it was the first time she had ever felt truly seen, truly wanted for who she was, not for what she represented or what she could provide. It was an act of profound and quiet rebellion against a world that had tried to define them. Later, they lay tangled together in the hay, their bodies still humming with the aftershock. The silence was comfortable, complete. Catherine traced the line of his jaw with her finger, her heart full of a feeling so vast and new it had no name. She leaned close and whispered against his skin, the words a solemn promise. "You will never forget this." He turned his head, and his fingers came up to linger on her lips, a silent acknowledgement. He would not. It was a moment burned into him, a brand of its own, but one of hope, not shame. The next morning, the barn was empty. Eli awoke in the hayloft alone, the space beside him cool. A knot of pure, cold dread tightened in his stomach. He scrambled down the ladder, his heart hammering. "Catherine?" There was no answer. He searched the small house, the yard, the chicken coop. She was gone. Panic, an emotion he had not felt in years, clawed at his throat. Had she run? Had she regretted what had happened between them? Had the town's cruelty finally driven her away for good? He saddled his horse with frantic, clumsy hands and began to search. Riding in ever-widening circles from the ranch, he scanned the horizon, his eyes aching, searching for any sign of her. He cursed himself, for his silence, for his walls, for letting himself feel something for a woman he knew he could not keep. He found her by the creek, the same place where he had comforted her after burying the calf. She was not running. She was simply standing at the water's edge, staring down at a piece of paper that was slowly dissolving in the current. Her shoulders were slumped in a posture of utter defeat. He dismounted and approached her quietly. She did not seem to hear him until he was standing beside her. She looked up, her eyes hollow. "I had to leave," she whispered, "before I brought you more trouble." "You are not trouble," he said, his voice raw. "I am," she insisted, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "I have always been trouble." She gestured to the disintegrating letter in the water. "That was from my father, written a year ago." She finally told him everything, the words spilling out in a torrent of long-suppressed pain. Graham Tooley was not her first failed match. There had been another, a man twice her age, a wealthy merchant to whom her father had owed a substantial debt. She was to be the payment. Her father, a man who valued his ledger books more than his own daughter, had sold her. She had fled 2 days before the wedding, taking what little money her mother had left her and running as far west as she could. The mail-order bride arrangement with Thule had been her last, desperate attempt to find some semblance of safety, of a respectable life. "I have been branded worthless by men who never knew me," she said, her voice breaking. "Men who saw me as an asset or a liability. You were the first one who looked at me like I was real." The raw vulnerability of her confession broke through the last of his defenses. This was the truth she had been running from, not a single man, but a world that saw her as a commodity. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. He was not a man of easy comforts, but he held her now as if he could absorb her pain into himself, as if he could shield her from the entire world. He tilted her head back and kissed her forehead, a gesture of pure, unadorned tenderness. "You are more real than anyone I have known," he said, the words an unbreakable vow. They stood by the creek for a long time, the quiet sounds of the water a balm on their wounded souls. A fragile peace settled over them, the peace of shared truths, of a future that finally seemed possible. But as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the plains, they saw a rider approaching the ranch. The man wore a tin star on his vest that glinted in the fading light. It was Deputy Miller. He rode with a grim purpose, and in his hand, he held a folded piece of paper, a warrant. The piece they had found by the creek was as fragile as a dragonfly's wing. It was shattered by the rhythmic clop of a horse's hooves and the jangle of a bridle. Deputy Miller reined in his horse a dozen yards away, his posture a poor imitation of authority. He was a man who hid a weak chin behind a scruffy beard, his power entirely borrowed from the star pinned crookedly to his vest. He did not dismount, choosing to look down on them, the warrant held in his hand like a holy decree. "Shepherd," he called out, his voice thin and reedy. "I have got an official complaint here, filed by Mr. Graham Thule." Eli moved, a slight, almost imperceptible shift, so that he was standing fully in front of Catherine. His body was a shield. "A complaint about what?" Eli's voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that seemed to carry more menace than a shout. "Fraud," the deputy announced, puffing out his chest. "And attempted theft, Mr. Thule claims this woman." He gestured with the warrant toward Catherine, refusing to meet her eyes. "Came to Redemption Creek under false pretenses, that she misrepresented herself with the intent of swindling him out of his good name and property. He paid her passage. He says she is a con artist, a grifter." Catherine flinched as if he had struck her. The words were the same ones Thule had used, now given the weight of the law. Eli did not even glance back at her. His focus was entirely on the deputy. His eyes narrowed to dark slits. Graham Thule is a liar and a coward. He humiliated this woman in front of the whole town because his pride was wounded. Now he is using the law to soothe it. That piece of paper is not worth the spit it would take to burn it. The deputy's face reddened. "This is a legal warrant. Shepherd, signed by the judge. I am here to take the woman into custody." "You are not taking anyone," Eli stated. It was not a threat. It was a simple declaration of fact, as plain and solid as the mountains behind them. "You can ride back to town and tell Thule that if he has business with Catherine Hale, he has business with me, and you can tell him I do not conduct my business with paper." There was a coiled stillness about Eli that was far more terrifying than any overt aggression. Deputy Miller had heard the stories. He knew he was looking at a man who had ended other men over matters of far less importance. The deputy swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating under Eli's cold stare. "You are obstructing justice." "Shepherd," he stammered, his hand hovering nervously near the pistol on his hip. "The sheriff will not take kindly to this. We will be back, with force." "We will be waiting," Eli said, his voice flat. It was a dismissal. After a moment of panicked indecision, Deputy Miller tugged on his reins, turned his horse, and spurred it into a trot, kicking up dust as he retreated. He did not look back. The moment he was out of sight, Catherine's composure crumbled. "Eli, you cannot do this," she pleaded, her hands clutching his arm. This is what I was afraid of. I have brought this trouble to your door. You must let me go. I will ride out, head for another territory. He will not follow me forever." "He will not follow you at all," Eli said, turning to face her. He took her hands in his grip firm and steadying. "Do you think I would let you ride out of here alone, with men like that looking for you? Do you think I would let them have you?" "But they will come back," she insisted, her voice thick with unshed tears. "With more men, they will ruin you, all because of me. I am not worth your home, your life." "You will let me be the judge of what you are worth," he said, his voice softening, but with an undercurrent of unshakable resolve. He looked down at her, at the fear and despair in her eyes, and he knew in that moment that his life of solitude was over. He had drawn a line in the dust, and she was on his side of it. He would not be driven back. "You are mine now," he said, the words coming from a place deeper than thought. "And I am not ashamed." The declaration hung in the air between them, simple and profound. It was not a claim of ownership, but a statement of allegiance, a binding of his fate to hers. He was choosing her, publicly and privately, against the town, against the law, against the quiet, safe life he had so carefully constructed. A single tear slid down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of disbelief, of a hope so fragile she was afraid to breathe on it. "We cannot stay here," he said, his mind already working. Miller was bluffing about the sheriff. For now, it will take him a day to get a posse together, if he can even manage it. We are going to buy ourselves some time. He looked up toward the rugged, pine-covered slopes of the mountains that bordered his land. We will go where they cannot easily follow. They worked with a silent, urgent efficiency, while Catherine packed a satchel with what little she had, her mending kit, the bar of scented soap he had bought her, a change of underclothes. Eli gathered supplies. He filled saddlebags with jerky, hardtack, coffee, and a small sack of oats for the horses. He took his Sharps rifle from its place over the mantelpiece, along with 2 pistols and a heavy box of ammunition. He filled 2 canteens with fresh water and strapped a pair of thick woolen blankets behind his saddle. He was a man preparing for a campaign, his movements precise and familiar. Within the hour, they were mounted, leading a pack mule behind them, and riding not toward the town, but away from it, into the deep, protective shadows of the mountain woods. The wilderness became their cathedral. They rode for hours, climbing higher into the mountains, leaving the dusty plains and the judgment of men far below. The air grew cool and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. Here, the world was governed by older, simpler laws, the changing of the light, the thirst for water, the need for shelter. The silence was vast, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the tall pines and the call of a distant hawk. It was a silence that invited confession. They made camp the first night in a small, hidden meadow, a stream of clear, cold water running through it. Eli built a small, smokeless fire in a hollow of rocks, its warmth pushing back the immense, star-dusted darkness. After a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, they sat together on a blanket, watching the embers glow. "My mother would have loved this," Catherine said softly, her voice seeming very small in the great emptiness. "She loved wild things. She taught me the names of all the flowers and the herbs." Eli remained silent, but it was an attentive silence, an invitation to continue. "She was not like the other women in our town," Catherine went on, her gaze lost in the fire. "She read books of poetry. She painted watercolors of the birds in our garden. My father said her head was full of useless notions. He was a practical man. Everything had a value that could be written in a ledger. A flower was a weed unless you could sell it. A book was a waste of lamplight." Her voice grew quiet. She grew paler every year, like a plant kept in a dark room. The doctors said it was a sickness of the lungs that took her, but I know she died of a broken heart. When she was gone, there was no one left to see any value in me. except what I might fetch on the marriage market." She hugged her knees to her chest. "All I have ever wanted was to belong somewhere, to someone, to be seen as something more than an entry in a ledger." Eli listened, his own ghosts stirring in the firelight. He understood the language of loss, the hollow ache of a world without a certain person in it. He looked at her, at the proud set of her jaw and the deep sorrow in her eyes, and knew he had to offer her a piece of his own brokenness. It was the only honest currency he had. "I had a younger brother," he began, his voice a low rasp. The words felt strange, like stones he had not turned over in years. "His name was Samuel. He was different from me. He saw the good in people, even when it was not there. He did not have a hard word for anyone." He paused, gathering the memories, the images sharp and painful as broken glass. "After the war, we were drifting. We took a job guarding a freight line through Arizona. The town we were based in was a hard place, full of men who thought their word was law and their hatred was justice. There was a small camp of Apache nearby, peaceful folk, mostly women and children, who came into town to trade. The men in town treated them like dogs." His hands clenched into fists in his lap. One afternoon, a few drunken cowboys cornered an Apache woman in the street. They were pulling at her clothes, calling her filthy names. Samuel, he could not stand by. He was just a boy, really 19. He stepped in. He told them to leave her be. They laughed at him. Then they got angry. They called him an Indian lover, a traitor to his own kind. Eli's voice grew thick, the memory a physical weight in his chest. "It happened so fast. A crowd gathered. They were like wolves. They had a rope. They dragged him to the big cottonwood tree in the center of town. I tried to stop them. I fired my gun in the air, but there were too many. They held me back. I had to watch." He choked on the words, the shame and rage of it still as raw as an open wound. "I had to watch them lynch my own brother for the crime of being a decent man." He fell silent, the crackle of the fire. The only sound, Catherine could see the scene reflected in his eyes, the firelight glinting on the unshed tears of a grief he had carried alone for 15 years. "Afterward," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "I hunted down every man who had a hand in it. I found them, one by one, and I made them pay. That is the part of the story they tell in Redemption Creek. That is why they fear me. They do not know why I did it. They do not know about Samuel." He finally looked at her, his face a mask of old, deep pain. "I came here to be alone because I do not trust people. I do not trust their laws, their towns, their brand of justice. I buried my heart with my brother. I did not think it could ever be dug up again." Tears were streaming down Catherine's face, silent tears of empathy for his unimaginable loss. She reached out and covered his clenched fist with her hand. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply shared his silence, her presence a balm on his ancient wound. "We are both ghosts," she whispered, her fingers lacing with his. "Haunted by the people we have lost and the people we used to be." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt scratching her cheek. "But here, with you, I feel alive." He put his arm around her and pulled her close, and they held each other in the vast, silent wilderness, two broken souls finding solace in the shadows of their shared campfire. On their 4th night in the mountains, their supplies of jerky were running low. Eli rose at dawn, his rifle in hand, to hunt for fresh meat. Catherine watched him disappear into the misty woods, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The hours passed. The sun climbed high in the sky. She busied herself by gathering more firewood and fetching water, but her ears were constantly strained for the sound of a rifle shot, for the sound of his return. It was mid-afternoon when she heard him, not the confident stride of a successful hunter, but a stumbling, crashing sound in the undergrowth. She ran to the edge of the camp and saw him staggering out of the trees, his face pale as ash, one hand pressed tightly to his thigh, where a dark stain was spreading rapidly through his trousers. "Eli!" she cried, rushing to his side. Boar, he gasped, leaning heavily on her. Surprised it. It caught me with its tusk before I could get a clean shot. She helped him the last few yards to the campfire and eased him down onto the blankets. Her fear was a cold, sharp thing, but she pushed it down, her mind racing. She had seen wounds like this before, helping the doctor in her old town. The danger was not just the wound itself, but the bleeding and the filth that a boar's tusk carried. Let me see, she said, her voice calm and steady, belying the frantic beating of her heart. With gentle hands, she used his hunting knife to slice open his trouser leg. The gash was deep and jagged, running 6 inches along his outer thigh. It was bleeding profusely, the blood welling up dark and thick. He was already growing weak, his breathing shallow. She knew she had to work fast. All the lessons from her mother, all the herbs she had learned, came rushing to the forefront of her mind. She ran to her satchel and pulled out a small cloth bundle. I need to stop the bleeding, she said, more to herself than to him. She grabbed a handful of the feathery yarrow leaves she had gathered and crushed them in her hands, packing the green pulp directly into the wound. Then she took a clean strip of linen from her bag and bound it tightly around his leg, creating a pressure bandage. He hissed in pain but did not complain. His eyes, clouded with pain, were fixed on her face, on her focused, determined expression. He was a man who had never relied on anyone, and now his life was in her hands. The bleeding slowed, then slowed again, until it was only a sluggish ooze. The first danger had passed. Now came the second. Infection. I have to clean it, Eli, she said softly. This will hurt. She spent the next hour tending to him with a focused intensity that left no room for fear. She boiled water in their small tin pot and used it to flush the wound, gently but thoroughly, washing away the dirt and grime. He gritted his teeth, his body rigid with pain, but he remained silent, his trust in her absolute. She made a poultice of another herb, a broad-leafed plantain, which she knew drew out poison and soothed inflammation, and applied it to the clean wound. Finally, using the fine needle and silk thread from her mending kit, she began to stitch the ragged edges of his skin together, her stitches small and neat. As she worked, her head bent low over his body. She was overcome by a wave of profound tenderness. This strong, self-sufficient man was so completely vulnerable, his life dependent on her skill. A tear she did not know she had been holding back splashed onto his skin. She paused, and, acting on an impulse she did not fully understand, she leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, her lips soft against his feverish skin. His eyes opened, and he looked at her. The pain was still there, but beneath it was something else, something deep and raw and full of a quiet wonder. The intimacy of her care, the gentle touch of her hands on his broken body, was a language more powerful than any words they had ever spoken. It was a bond forged not in passion, but in the crucible of life and death. She finished her work, bandaging the leg with the last of her clean linen. He was weak and pale, but his breathing was deeper, his color slowly returning. He had lost a lot of blood, but he would live. She had saved him. He drifted into an exhausted sleep. She sat beside him through the long night, bathing his face with cool water when the fever rose, giving him sips of willow bark tea when he woke. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of rose and gray, his fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear, and looked at her, his loyal, tireless sentinel. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He lifted a hand and touched her tired face. "You saved me." "We saved each other," she replied softly. They stayed in the mountains for 2 more days while he regained his strength. The balance between them had shifted. He was no longer just her protector. She was his. They were equals, partners in a way that transcended all other definitions. The experience had burned away the last of their reservations, the last of their fears. They knew with a certainty that was as solid as the mountains around them, that they would face whatever came next together. On the third morning, he stood, testing his wounded leg. It was stiff and sore, but it would hold. "It is time to go back," he said. She nodded, her expression resolute. "Yes, it is time." They rode back down the mountain, not as two fugitives running from the law, but as two people returning home to claim their lives. As they emerged from the tree line and onto the open plains, the setting sun lit the entire sky on fire. The clouds were streaked with crimson and gold, a vast, breathtaking spectacle beneath that wide, blood-red sunset. Eli reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. She laced her fingers through his, their grip firm and unbreakable. They rode on toward Redemption Creek, toward the coming storm, together. Their return to Redemption Creek was not a retreat. They rode side by side down the main street, the pack mule trailing behind them, their heads held high. They did not look like fugitives. They looked like sovereigns returning to claim their land. The hand-holding had stopped at the edge of town, but the connection remained, an invisible current that flowed between them. People stopped what they were doing and stared. Whispers followed them like a trail of dust. Catherine could feel the burn of 100 eyes, but this time, nestled in the quiet strength of Eli's presence, the shame was mixed with a defiant pride. She would not be cowed again. They hitched their horses not at the general store, but directly in front of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a man in his late 50s, with a weary face and eyes that had seen too much trouble to be easily surprised. He was sitting at his desk, nursing a cup of coffee. When they walked in, Graham Tooley was there with him, leaning against the wall, a smug look on his fleshy face that curdled into a scowl the moment he saw them. "Well, well," Tooley sneered, pushing himself off the wall. "Look what the mountain coughed up. I see you found my runaway thief. Shepard saves the posse the trouble of hunting you both down." Eli ignored him completely, his attention fixed on the sheriff. "Sheriff Brody," he said, his voice calm and even. "My deputy paid me a visit a few days ago." "He said you had some business with Miss Hale." Sheriff Brody sighed, setting his coffee cup down with a tired clink. He looked from Eli's unyielding face to Catherine's composed one. He was a man caught in the middle, a position he deeply disliked. "Graham here filed a complaint. Eli, a serious one. Fraud. He has got a judge to sign a warrant. A warrant based on the word of a man who publicly humiliated a woman for not being pretty enough for his tastes." Eli stated flatly. "A complaint filed out of spite, not justice." "It is my right," Tooley blustered, his face turning a blotchy red. "She came here to swindle me. She took my money for passage, and then when I saw her for what she was, she ran off to shack up with him. She is a woman of loose morals, a common vagrant." "You will not speak of her that way," Eli said, his voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone the deputy had found so unsettling. He did not raise his voice, did not move a muscle, but the threat in the room became as thick as smoke. Tooley fell silent, his bravado no match for the cold promise of violence in Eli's eyes. Catherine finally spoke, her voice clear and without a tremor. "I took nothing from Mr. Tooley that he did not offer freely. I came here in good faith, based on the promises he made in his letters. When he broke that faith, I left. I have stolen nothing. I have defrauded no one." Sheriff Brody looked at her, at the quiet dignity she possessed, and a seed of doubt was planted. He had known Graham Tooley for years and was well aware of his vanity and his temper. He also knew Eli Shepard, a man who kept to himself but had never been known to lie. "Be that as it may," the sheriff said, rubbing his tired eyes. "The warrant is legal. I am bound to act on it. Graham is pressing the matter." By now, a crowd had started to gather outside, drawn by the sight of Eli's and Catherine's horses and the prospect of a confrontation. The street was filling with curious onlookers, their faces a mixture of judgment, pity, and hungry anticipation. Redemption Creek was a town starved for drama, and this was a feast. Eli glanced out the window at the gathering crowd. He seemed to come to a decision. "This is not a matter for a dusty office," he said to the sheriff. "This is a public accusation. It deserves a public answer." Before the sheriff could protest, Eli turned and walked out the door, Catherine at his side. He did not stop on the boardwalk, but walked to the center of the street, to the steps of the small clapboard town hall. He turned to face the crowd, his tall frame a commanding presence. Catherine stood beside him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve absolute. She would stand with him. The townspeople fell silent, their murmurs dying away. In the front row of faces, Catherine could see the women from the general store, their expressions a mask of smug righteousness. But farther back, she saw other faces too. The blacksmith's wife, a woman who had lost a child the previous winter, looked on with an expression of weary empathy. A few of the younger ranch wives seemed to watch with a quiet, defiant curiosity. The town was not a single beast, she realized. It was a collection of hearts, some hard, some soft, all of them watching to see what would happen next. Eli's eyes swept over the crowd, missing nothing. He was not a man for speeches, and he did not try to be. His words were plain, hammered into shape like horseshoes, each one carrying weight. "You all know me," he began, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "You know I do not seek out the company of this town. I have my reasons for that. You have all heard the stories about me. Some of them are true. But one thing you know is that I do not meddle in other men's affairs." He paused, letting the words sink in. "A few weeks ago, this woman, Catherine Hale, came to my ranch seeking shelter. She was running from a cruelty you all witnessed and did nothing to stop." He glanced at Graham Tooley, who was now standing on the sheriff's porch, his face a thundercloud. "Now this man claims she is a criminal. He uses the law to punish her for a slight to his own vanity. He calls her a thief, a woman of no morals." Eli's gaze returned to the crowd. "You look at her, and you whisper. You call her a harlot. You judge what you do not understand. You have passed your sentence on her without ever knowing her name. Well, I know her heart, and I know her honor." He turned then and looked at Catherine, and the entire world seemed to fall away. The crowd, the town, the threat of the law, it all vanished. There was only his face, his eyes dark and full of a feeling so powerful it took her breath away. "If being with her is a crime," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that was absolute, "then I will pay for it with my name." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was more than a defense. It was a confession, a declaration. Then he did something that no one in Redemption Creek could have ever predicted. The reclusive, hard-bitten rancher, the man they called a killer, knelt down on one knee in the dusty street. Before the entire town, he took Catherine's hand, the one that had stitched his wound and tended his home, and he looked up at her. "Catherine Hale," he said, his voice for her alone, though the whole town was listening. "I have nothing to offer you but a hard life, a small piece of land, and a name that is more feared than respected. But it is all I have, and it is yours, if you will have it. Will you marry me?" The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence filled with the utter shock of 100 people. Catherine stared down at him, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his earnest, upturned face. She saw the future he was offering her, a future of hardship, of struggle, of being an outcast with him. But it was also a future of belonging, a future of being real. She thought of the weight of the scandal, the trouble she had brought him, the danger that still lay ahead. "Eli," she whispered, her voice trembling. Are you sure? Are you sure you want to be tied to a scandal?" He rose to his feet, his hand still holding hers, his gaze unwavering. "I would rather be tied to your name," he said, his voice soft but clear as a bell. Then forget what you mean to me. That was her answer. That was everything. She squeezed his hand, her tears now flowing freely, and she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Eli, I will. A murmur swept through the crowd, a complex sound of disbelief, grudging respect, and, for some, a touch of romantic wonder. The situation had been irrevocably changed. Sheriff Brody had watched the entire scene from his porch. He was a practical man. He now had a choice. He could arrest a woman who had just been publicly claimed and proposed to by one of the toughest men in the territory, turning Graham Tooley's personal vendetta into a full-blown town crisis. Or he could let the matter drop. He made a practical decision. He stepped forward. Graham, he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. This is a civil matter now. It is a he said, she said affair between a man and his intended bride. There is not enough evidence here for me to arrest this woman and hold her in my jail. If you want to pursue it, you will have to take it to the circuit judge when he comes through in the spring. As for this warrant, I am considering it null and void. Graham Tooley's face was a mask of pure, apoplectic rage. You cannot be serious, Brody. You are letting them get away with it. I am preventing this town from tearing itself apart over your wounded pride, the sheriff said flatly. The matter's closed. He turned and went back into his office, shutting the door behind him. Tooley stood there for a moment, his fists clenched, his eyes boring into Eli and Catherine with a look of pure hatred. He spun around and spat on the ground. You will regret this, rancher, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. Then he stomped off toward the saloon, his fury a palpable thing. The crowd began to disperse, the people breaking off into small, buzzing groups, eager to dissect the day's incredible events. Eli and Catherine stood alone in the center of the street, the world slowly coming back into focus. Come, Eli said gently. Let's go see the preacher. They were married the next morning. The small chapel was filled with the soft light of the rising sun, dust motes dancing in the beams that slanted through the colored glass. It was a quiet affair. The preacher, a kind-faced man named Reverend Michael, presided. His wife stood as a witness. Mr. Abernathy was there, too, his round face etched with a look of deep contrition. He had come to Eli the evening before, hat in hand, and apologized for his part in Catherine's humiliation, offering them any supplies they needed on credit. His presence was a small but significant sign that the town's tide might be turning. Catherine wore her cream-colored dress, the one she had arrived in. She had no other. She held a small, simple bouquet of wild purple asters that Eli had picked for her from the banks of the creek that morning. When she said her vows, her voice was strong and clear. When Eli said his, the words were a bedrock, solid and sure. When the preacher declared them man and wife, Eli did not kiss her. Instead, he simply took her hand, a gesture that was somehow more intimate, a quiet confirmation of the bond they had forged. That night, they returned to the small ranch house. It was theirs now, their home. He had moved her few belongings from the barn into the single bedroom. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the simple room. On the bed, laid out carefully, was the delicate white veil she had arrived in, the one she had intended for another man, in another life. She looked at it, a symbol of so much pain and humiliation. Eli came and stood behind her. He picked it up, the fine netting soft as a whisper in his rough hands. She thought he would throw it in the fire, a final purging of the past. But he did not. Instead, he gently placed it over her hair. He turned her to face him, his eyes full of a deep, quiet tenderness. Now, he said softly, his voice a low murmur in the firelit room. It is ours. He reached up and slowly, reverently, lifted the veil from her face. He was not just lifting a piece of fabric. He was lifting away her past shame, claiming it, and making it a part of their story. He was a man who hid his heart in graves, but for her, He had dug it up and laid it bare. He kissed her then, a long, slow kiss of trust and promise. They consummated their marriage not in the desperate, secret passion of the hayloft, but with the quiet, profound certainty of two people who had found their harbor. It was a joining not just of bodies, but of scarred and healing souls. The next day dawned bright and clear, full of the fragile promise of a new beginning. They woke in each other's arms, the world for a moment feeling safe and whole. They ate a quiet breakfast, their hands brushing, their glances speaking a language all their own. A future, once an impossible dream, now seemed to stretch before them, a path they would walk together. They stepped out onto the porch, into the crisp morning air, ready to begin the day's work, to begin their life, and then they saw it. A column of thick black smoke was billowing into the blue sky from behind the rise where their barn stood. Eli's face went hard as granite. He was running before Catherine could even cry out, his healing leg protesting but not slowing him. She ran after him, her heart seizing with a cold, terrifying dread. They crested the hill and stopped, the sight before them a vision from hell. The barn, their barn, the place where she had found shelter, the place where they had first kissed, was an inferno. Flames leapt high into the air, devouring the old, dry wood with a hungry, monstrous roar. The roof had already collapsed, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the sky. It was too late. There was nothing to be saved. The home of their animals, the store of their hay and grain, the symbol of their livelihood, was being reduced to ash before their eyes. As Eli stood, his body rigid with a silent, helpless fury, Catherine saw something white nailed to a fence post a safe distance from the fire. It was a piece of rough board, hastily painted. She walked toward it, her legs feeling like lead. 4 words were scrawled in black paint, the letters dripping like poison. "You'll regret this, rancher." She stared at the words, the malice behind them a physical blow. This was Thule's revenge, swift and brutal. She looked from the sign to the burning barn, then to Eli. He was looking at the wreckage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw set so tight a muscle jumped. She saw the grief in his eyes, but beneath it, she did not see defeat. She saw a cold, hard resolve that mirrored her own. She walked to him and slipped her hand into his. He turned his head, his dark eyes finding hers. In that shared gaze, they knew. They had lost almost everything, but they had not lost each other. They were scarred, but they were not broken. The fire had taken their barn, but it had forged them into something stronger. Together, they turned back to face the smoking ruins of their past, ready to build their future from the ashes. The ashes of the old barn were not an ending, but a foundation. In the days that followed the fire, a subtle shift occurred in Redemption Creek. While some still held to their harsh judgments, many saw Graham Thule's act for what it was, the spiteful, cowardly destruction of a man's livelihood. It was an act that went against the unwritten code of the West, where a man's sweat and toil were his own sacred ground. The fire had not just burned Eli's barn, it had illuminated the darkness in Thule's soul for all to see. Help came tentatively at first. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, rode out with his 2 strapping sons, offering a day's labor to clear the charred debris. Mr. Abernathy arrived in his wagon, loaded with donated timber, his face a study in quiet apology. Even a few of the ranch wives, led by the preacher's wife, came with baskets of food and quiet words of support. They spoke to Catherine not as a scandal, but as a neighbor, a sister. She was no longer just the runaway bride. She was Mrs. Shepherd, a woman who had stood her ground. And in this hard land, resilience was a virtue more valuable than any pedigree. Eli accepted their help with a quiet, grateful dignity that surprised them. They were used to the solitary, walled-off man, this Eli, who worked alongside them, who shared their water and their bread, was someone new. He was a man who was letting the world back in, one plank of timber at a time. Together, they raised a new barn, stronger and sturdier than the one it replaced. Eli and Catherine worked the hardest, their hands raw, their muscles aching, but their spirits bound together by the shared act of creation. The new barn was not just a building, it was a testament, a monument to their refusal to be broken. The months that followed were a season of quiet, steady growth. The ranch, under their combined efforts, began to flourish. Eli's knowledge of the land and Catherine's meticulous planning were a formidable combination. The herd grew, the fences were strong, and the small house, once a bastion of lonely survival, became a home filled with the scent of baking and the low murmur of conversation in the evenings. Eli began trading horses again, his reputation for having the best stock in the territory slowly rebuilding. Men who had once feared him now came to do business with him, and they found a man who was hard but fair, a man whose word was his bond. The fear was still there, a healthy respect for the lines one did not cross, but it was now tempered with a grudging admiration. Catherine found her own purpose beyond the boundaries of the ranch. She had noticed the daughters of the other ranchers, girls whose education consisted of chores and scripture, their minds as untended as a fallow field. With Eli's encouragement, she turned their small parlor into a schoolhouse twice a week. She taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to a small, eager group of girls who came on horseback from miles around. She showed them the world through books. She taught them to write their own names with pride. She gave them a glimpse of a life where a woman's mind was her most valuable asset. She was not just a teacher. She was planting seeds of possibility in the hard-packed soil of the West. Their life together found its own rhythm. It was a life of shared labor and quiet companionship. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of coffee just as the sun was rising, without a word. It was in the way she would have a hot meal waiting for him, no matter how late he came in from the fields. It was in the shared glance across a crowded room in town, a silent confirmation that they were a world unto themselves. The passion of the hayloft had deepened into something richer, a love that was as steady and enduring as the mountains on the horizon. But a poison like Graham Tooley's hatred does not simply dry up and blow away. It festers in the darkness, waiting for its moment. His business had suffered. The town's disapproval was a constant, public humiliation. Every sign of Eli and Catherine's success was another turn of the knife in his wounded pride. He could not stand it. He began spending his evenings in the darker corners of the saloon, drinking heavily, his bitterness attracting the dregs of society like flies to a corpse. He found 3 men, drifters with mean eyes and a thirst for cheap whiskey and easier money. They were men with no stake in the community, no code of honor, and they were willing to do his dirty work for a handful of silver. The threat, when it came, was as silent and insidious as a snake in the grass. It was a hot, dry night late in the summer, the air still and thick, the moon a pale sliver behind a haze of clouds. A sudden gust of wind brought the smell of smoke to Eli's nostrils. It was not the familiar scent of their own hearth fire. It was the acrid, hungry smell of dry grass burning. He was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his boots and trousers. "Catherine, wake up! Fire!" She was awake at once, her heart leaping with a familiar dread. They ran outside and saw it, an angry orange glow on the horizon, perilously close to the northern pasture where their horses were grazing. The wind was picking up, fanning the flames, pushing a wall of fire directly toward the fence line. There was no time for thought, only for action. "Get the blankets from the house and soak them in the water trough," Eli yelled, already running toward the corral to release the animals. "I will try to head them south, away from the flames." The night was plunged into a terrifying chaos. The air was thick with smoke that burned the eyes and choked the lungs. The frightened whinnies of the horses were a sound of pure panic. Eli, a dark silhouette against the fiery backdrop, worked with a desperate, focused calm, his voice a steady command that cut through the animals' terror, urging them through the gate and away from the approaching inferno. Catherine worked with a frantic energy she did not know she possessed. She dragged the heavy woolen blankets to the trough, her arms straining, and submerged them in the cool water. They became immensely heavy, but she hauled them out, one by one, and ran toward the fire line. She had seen ranchers do this before, using wet blankets to beat at the edges of a grass fire, to smother it, to starve it of its fuel. They met at the edge of the flames, a husband and wife united against a common enemy. They were a whirlwind of coordinated motion. Eli, with a wet burlap sack, attacked the taller flames, his powerful swings beating them back. Catherine, with a heavy, sodden blanket, worked on the lower, creeping edges of the fire, her face black with soot, her lungs screaming for clean air. They fought side by side, their movements a desperate, unspoken dance. They did not have to speak. They knew what the other would do. They were a single unit, fueled by the fierce, primal need to protect their home, their life, their future. For what felt like an eternity, they battled the blaze. The heat was scorching, the smoke a suffocating blanket. They gained a few feet, only to have a gust of wind push them back, but slowly, painstakingly. Their efforts began to tell. The wall of flame became a line, then a series of smaller, isolated fires. They were winning. It was in the moment of that small victory that Catherine stumbled. She had been breathing the thick, toxic smoke for too long. Her lungs, starved of oxygen, finally gave out. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the fiery landscape dissolving into black spots before her eyes. She gasped for a breath that would not come. And then the world went dark. She collapsed to the scorched earth, the wet blanket falling from her nerveless hands. Eli saw her fall. A sound of pure, primal terror was torn from his throat, a roar of anguish that was louder than the fire itself. He abandoned the flames and was at her side in 3 long strides. He knelt and gathered her limp form into his arms. Her face was pale beneath the soot, her lips tinged with blue. He put his ear to her chest. Nothing, no breath, no heartbeat. For a single, gut-wrenching moment, his world ended. The man who had faced down death 100 times, who had buried his brother, his comrades, his own heart, was shattered by a terror greater than any he had ever known. The thought of losing her was not a wound. It was an annihilation. "No," he breathed. The word, a prayer, a command, a desperate plea to a God he no longer believed in. "No, you will not leave me." He lifted her body terrifyingly limp, and carried her away from the lingering smoke, back toward the clean air near the house. He laid her gently on the grass. His mind, trained in the brutal arts of survival, took over. He remembered seeing a scout do this during the war, for a man who had nearly drowned. He turned her onto her stomach and began to press firmly and rhythmically on her back, trying to force the poison from her lungs, to compel them to work again. "Breathe, Catherine," he pleaded, his voice cracking. Tears he did not know he had streaming down his face, carving clean paths through the soot. "Breathe, damn you, breathe." He pushed and pushed, his desperation mounting with every silent, unresponsive second. He called her name over and over, his voice raw with a grief that was already consuming him. He was losing her. After everything, after fighting so hard to find her, to claim her, he was losing her to a coward's fire. And then a small, shuddering gasp. He stopped, his hands frozen on her back. He waited, his entire being focused on that one. Fragile sound. Another gasp, this one stronger, followed by a weak, ragged cough. He turned her over gently. Her eyes fluttered open. They were bloodshot and full of confusion, but they were open. She coughed again, a deep, racking sound, and then she began to breathe. The breaths shallow and painful, but they were breaths. She was alive. He collapsed beside her, his strength utterly gone, and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the only anchor in a spinning world. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with the aftershocks of his terror and the overwhelming tidal wave of his relief. He had almost lost his reason to live. The next morning, leaving a recovering Catherine in the care of the preacher's wife, Eli rode into town. He did not go to the saloon looking for vengeance. He went to the sheriff's office. He had changed. He no longer believed he was the only source of justice in the world. He laid out the facts, his voice cold and hard as iron. Sheriff Brody listened, his weary face grim. Armed with Eli's testimony, he went to the saloon and found Tooley's 3 hired men trying to blend in with the morning drinkers. Their soot-stained clothes and nervous glances gave them away. Under the weight of the sheriff's questions, the youngest of the 3, a boy with fear in his eyes, broke down completely. He confessed everything, implicating Graham Tooley as the man who had paid them, the man who had ordered the fire. The arrest of Graham Tooley was a public spectacle. Sheriff Brody marched him out of his hotel, his hands bound, his face a pasty, sweating mask of disbelief. The town turned out to watch, but this time there was no division. There was only a cold, universal contempt. Tooley had crossed a line. He had endangered not just a man he hated, but the very fabric of their community. He had brought the kind of lawlessness they had all worked so hard to escape. His humiliation was absolute. He lost his business, his standing, everything. A week later, he was gone, leaving Redemption Creek under the cover of darkness, a broken man erased by his own malice. In the quiet aftermath, as the land began to heal and the scent of smoke finally faded from the air, Eli and Catherine stood on their porch, looking out at the sunset. The sky was painted in soft, gentle colors, a promise of peace. "I came here with nothing but a dress and a lie," Catherine said, her voice soft in the twilight. "You gave me a life." Eli turned to her, his hand finding hers. He looked at her, his wife, his partner, the woman who had resurrected his heart from its grave. "You," he answered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "gave me a reason to live." They rebuilt the burned section of fence, but they did it slowly this time. Not with the frantic energy of survival, but with the quiet contentment of people who were savoring every moment. They were building a life. Not just a ranch, and it was a task that was meant to be cherished. One evening, as the last light of the sun bled across the horizon, Eli found her in the new barn. She was standing in the shadows of the loft, in the very spot where he had first kissed her with such desperation. The air was sweet with the scent of fresh-cut hay and enduring love. He climbed the ladder and went to her. She turned, a slow, knowing smile on her face. She reached out and pulled him close, her arms wrapping around his neck. The setting sun cast a golden glow through the high window, illuminating the dust motes that danced around them like tiny, silent stars. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear, and she whispered the words again. The promise she had made on a night that felt like a lifetime ago. "You will never forget this." A smile, genuine and deep, touched Eli's lips. He pulled her closer, his heart full. "I never did," he replied. "Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel, and feel free to share your thoughts in English.